The deadline for all federal workers to get the COVID-19 vaccine is coming up on November 22nd. The Office of Personnel Management reports that federal workers have used only 58% of special emergency paid leave funding. Don Kettl is Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Don, welcome to the program.
It's great to be with you here.
So federal employees used less than 60% of the available funding for emergency paid leave for the COVID-19. Was there just an overestimation, do you think, of how much leave workers would need as a result of the pandemic?
Well, it's a combination of things, I think, and part a bit of an overestimation. There was an effort to try to make sure that no matter what, there was going to be plenty of money to take care of the federal workers who decided to take advantage of it. But it also, I think, reflects a concern on the part of at least some feds about taking up on this. The distribution across different federal agencies has been very different, and as has been the case in lots of state and local governments, it's blue-collar workers who have in many ways been the point of the spear of trying to sort these issues out.
Do you think that the creation of the fund is going to be a precedent for the future?
It's a precedent for sure, because one of these things, once it's done, when new problems come up, you can reach back and say, has anybody ever done this before? And if the answer is yes, it makes it that much easier to do the next time. But also, given the fact that only 58% of the funds were spent, it will certainly raise questions about, in the future, how much money may be needed to be put on the table if we ever need to go down this road again. And unfortunately, the odds are that at some point, in some way, with something coming up, we're going to have to try to confront this question sometime in the future.
I want to ask you about the vaccine deadline, because practically it's November 8th, right? So employees need to have a 2-week waiting period after their second dose to meet the November 22nd deadline. What do you think enforcement's going to look like, especially this is right before Thanksgiving?
Well, that's the thing, that the deadline as it was set up in some ways makes sense in terms of trying to get federal employees vaccinated, but the idea of handing out either suspensions, leave without pay, and other kinds of disciplinary actions right before Thanksgiving is something that somehow feels like it's not likely to be able to happen. And in addition to that, in the background is a running battle about whether or not contractors themselves need to be vaccinated. And there is lots of pressures to try to push that deadline back. And if contractors' deadlines are going to be pushed back, and if, for example, some of the state lawsuits on that are successful, because there are 11 governors now suing to try to stop the effort to try to force contractors to be vaccinated, then it creates that much more pressure to try to relax, at least in some ways, the deadline for federal employees. So I suspect we're going to see lots of haggling as we go down these next couple of weeks.
But Don, I do want to ask you a little bit more about the contractor deadline, but going back to the federal deadline, right. If there's really no enforcement, what's the use of a vaccine mandate? What's the use of a deadline?
Well, I think in part it's a way of trying to encourage people to be able to get the vaccine. Creating a deadline creates at least some psychic pressure to try to be able to get that to happen. It's clear that in the private sector, creating deadlines has really had a significant impact in getting people vaccinated. It's also a way of trying to say, that maybe we're going to ease up on some of these restrictions and some of the penalties that may be down the line, but sooner or later it may happen. Maybe I'll just go out and get the vaccine anyway. In addition to that, many of the individuals who are trying to consider whether or not to get the vaccination have kids as well, and those vaccines have been approved as well. That also reduces some of the barriers. So I suspect that it's more psychic pressure at this point, but trying to get to the point in the federal government of saying to people, especially right before Thanksgiving, you're going to be penalized, is something that somehow seems not likely to happen.
So going back to what you were saying about the contractor deadline and the pressure to move that back, what does that do for the dynamic if those things don't really line up between the contractor's vaccine mandate and the federal vaccine mandate?
Yeah, contractors are such an important part of, in many ways, the public service workforce. And if it turns out that, first of all, the contractor deadline turns out to get a little bit on the mushy side, if it turns out that some of the state actions to try to prevent the imposition of that kind of mandate are successful, or at least create more political problems, and then if it turns out that federal employees are responsible for trying to enforce the deadlines that are imposed on contractors, it makes for an extremely messy situation. And it's very hard if it turns out that these things are not in sync, especially if we say, federal employees, you have to meet the deadline. Contractors, we're going to slip things back. And then, of course, with the contractors, we start getting into the Christmas holidays, and there's going to be pressure to say, well, let's at least give people until after the first of the year. And that just creates even more tension about different standards that may be imposed by on different groups at different times by different people.
You know, Don, you've said there's no going back to March of 2020. It's not out of the question for, you know, another strain of COVID-19 to pick up, or for there to be another pandemic. What would it look like for federal workers if that were to happen?
Well, and one of the things we have to do that I think we've learned is that we simply can't assume that now, okay, this is all done, we're going to go back to the way everything was back before the pandemic. That's just something that can happen, won't happen, shouldn't happen. We've learned a lot about the way in which the workforce can operate, and that's something we have, I think, learned that we can have new ways of trying to enhance productivity by trying to think about work from home options and other ways of trying to use that to recruit new federal employees. In addition to that, though, we have to at least consider the possibility that another strain, another kind of variant may pop up, and we may have to go through all this all over again. The best defense against that is vaccinating as many people as possible. But we have to begin now by planning the possibility of either another variant or some kind of other issue in the future that creates the need to try to have more flexibility in the workforce. And the worst mistake we could make is to fail to learn the lessons that we've learned so painfully over the last 18 months.
All right, well, Don, thanks as always, and appreciate you being on the program.
It's so great to be with you.